Hello, hello, Dr. Flavio here. So, we've been talking about this idea of a personal breakdown. And I just want to say to you that this is way more common than most people realize when a person breaks down from within. Now, I want to warn you ahead of time we don't really have a language for what I'm about to describe yet. It's not in the books, it's not in the DSM, this big, thick book that describes all kinds of mental illnesses. It's not quite well understood yet, even though we all know what we mean by it. And I'll try to make some sense of this for you today. But listen, the reason why it is more common than we realize is because there are very few external signs of this condition. In other words, you might be walking down the road and you see a person, and this person may look fine to you if you never met them before, but inside, that person is completely devastated and broken. So I wrote an article once, many, many years ago, about this idea of smiling depression. So the person, we have this idea that a depressed person is one who is lying down under the table all day long, or they don't want to get out of bed, And that is certainly one way in which depression can manifest, but it can also manifest in several other ways, one of which is this idea of smiling depression. The person might appear publicly as someone who is actually really happy, always smiling, but deep within they're broken and depressed. So let's talk a little bit about this breakdown and what are some of the things that happens within the person so that we can begin to develop a language to understand how to solve the problem. So in one of my books, I talk about this, right? If a person breaks an arm and they have a cast on it, or if they are on a wheelchair, and let's say you enter a store and you're in a wheelchair, everybody knows that you have a problem. But if you're broken from within, nobody knows that you have a problem. The person doesn't even get any sympathy. They don't even get any recognition. They don't even get any help most of the time. And that makes the whole problem way more difficult to fix. So what are some of the things that happens to the person? There will be depression there, but the problem isn't depression. In other words, if you take a person who broke down and you only treat them as you would normally for depression, let's say with medications or even psychotherapy for depression, it will not work. Because although there is depression there, their problem isn't depression. So it's bigger than that. If you treat them for anxiety, you might give them anxiolytic medications, you might give them, benzodiazepines, you might give them medications to reduce anxiety, and it might help them sleep a little bit better, because one of the things that happens is sleep is disrupted. But the point is that although there is anxiety as well, their problem isn't anxiety. So there is depression, but it's not depression. There is anxiety, but it's not anxiety. Weight, body weight, there will be changes in body weight invariably. About half the people in our culture will, in this situation, when there's this breakdown, about half of them will gain weight. Remember, I've been doing this for 30 years, so I've compiled a lot of statistics. About half the people will gain weight, usually quite fast and quite a bit, to the degree that you notice they changed, they look different, they gain a lot of weight. I'm not talking about a couple pounds here and there. I'm talking about like 10, 20, 30, 40 pounds. I mean, they transform the way their body looks. Of the other half, about half of them will lose weight. In other words, 25% will lose weight actually. They lose interest in eating, they cannot taste food anymore, there's no pleasure in eating, whatever, they stop eating. And the other half, which is like a quarter of the total, right? They will alternate, they'll gain and lose weight. And you can tell this person's like losing and gaining 10, 20 pounds, cyclically, which is a big stressor on the body, right? So weight will always change up or down or up and down. Sleep will be totally disrupted. Not only the circadian rhythm itself, in other words, they might sleep during the day, be awake at night. That is very common, but quite a bit of insomnia. In other words, they can't really sleep. But whatever amount of sleep they do get, there will be they will wake up startled in the middle of the night. In other words, people tell me all the time, they say they wake up in a panic. They wake up with their hearts racing, whether or not it is related to a dream. They just wake up in a panic type of thing. So sleep becomes very, very fragmented because usually people don't enter sleep peacefully. They crash out of exhaustion. You see, they can't sleep, and so they stay awake and awake and awake and awake, and eventually they sort of crash out of exhaustion. And when they do, they quickly wake up in a sort of a panic. Oh my gosh, what's going on? Heart racing, that kind of thing. So sleep is totally disrupted. So depression, anxiety will be there, although if you only treat them for that, it will not work. Sleep will be completely disrupted, but it isn't a simple sleep disorder either, because you can try to medicate them to sleep and it might help a little bit, but that will not solve the problem. There will be weight changes, and again, you can use diets, whatever, it won't work because the person is broken from within. They call this ahedonia. They completely lose the pleasure for life. This is one of the features of depression, but it goes beyond that. They sort of lose interest in living, or they sort of lose interest in their lives as they know it. They become someone else. And another thing that happens is that they become obsessed in a sense. And I say this word, and I'm not using the word here from a psychological perspective, like the definitions in the book, and I'm not using the word in any way that is demeaning to the person going through this. I'm simply explaining what happens. The person becomes obsessed. They become very preoccupied with understanding what happened to them, to the degree that that's all they can talk about. What happened to me, what happened to me, what she did, what he did, what the company did, what my health is doing, what my liver is doing, what my heart is doing. In other words, whether it's a health scare or a betrayal at work or in a personal relationship, whatever the inciting event was, they become absolutely preoccupied with that. I have worked with people, for instance, who were falsely accused of crimes. I remember back in the old days, I had an office in Miami where we have a very large Cuban population, and a lot of the stuff has waned. It's no longer prominent. But back in the 90s, when I started working, there were a lot of people who had been imprisoned in Cuba for political reasons. These were not criminals in the formal sense of the word, people who were killing, stealing. It wasn't like that. They were placed in prison because of their political views, and this was very common back in the 60s and 70s in Cuba, and a lot of those people were eventually released and ended up in Miami, and I ended up working with quite a few of those people. And the whole idea that you might be a law-abiding citizen and you might be honest and you might be productive in society, suddenly the government changes and you express your views and you're placed in jail for 5, 10, 20 years, that breaks down the person. So by the time I would meet them, they would be absolutely enveloped in that discourse. That's all they could talk about. How they went to jail, what happened, how there was no trial, how this and that. And there's this incessant need to explain their innocence. And I guess the word obsession applies here, but it's a very sad situation because the person becomes absolutely focused on what happened to them. All right, so these are the types of things that you see when there is a breakdown. I'm going to invite you to comment on these videos because what we're talking about here is so incredibly common, and it is an unseen epidemic. In other words, like I said earlier, you're not going to see the person in a wheelchair or with a cast on their arm or legs. In other words, you don't see this from the outside. You might know that the person is suffering if you know them well, if you're close to them, but you might be at work in your job, and there might be a person there who's completely broken, and nobody will even know about it. And unfortunately, the risk of the person harming themselves increases quite a bit. It isn't that they are necessarily suicidal. Suicidality is a whole different topic. It isn't necessarily that. The issue is that they sort of lose interest in life as we know it. It becomes unimportant to them. And so it is a risk when a person is in that state. This is something for you to be aware of in case you know of somebody who might be going through a difficult patch in their lives, because maybe there's something that you can do. Listen, subscribe to this channel, make your comments below. Let me know if you're facing this situation or if you know of someone who is, so that we can enter into this dialogue, and I'll show you how you can be of service and of help to the person whom you know who may be suffering quite a bit. All right? Thank you. I'm Dr. Flavius. Great talking to you.